Welcome to everybody who is joining us for this session, whatever time of day it is, wherever you are joining us from around the world. For some of you, this might be the first session that you are joining of Innovation 2020, so a very special welcome from me. Just to set the background, Innovation 2020 is all about bringing civil servants from different countries, different departments, different professions together to discuss innovation that's already happening, to look at the barriers that might be in place to innovation, and hopefully come up with some of the practical solutions and ideas for how we can overcome those barriers going forward. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant and now a government commentator and a facilitator in these events. And the panel that we are about to enter into now is a panel discussion on programme governance and finance. And in a moment, I will say a little bit more about that topic. I will introduce our panel members as well. But in the meantime, I want you all who are joining us to be thinking about the questions that you might like to put to our expert panel members, because hopefully at the end of the discussion, we will have a chance to answer some of the questions that you have put as well. So in terms of the topic, programme governance and finance, well, most countries' systems of accountability, funding and management run vertically down deep departmental structures. But many civil service innovations demand collaborative, cross-departmental actions and programmes. And this poses a challenge to traditional approaches to project governance, demanding shared structures that retain clear lines of accountability whilst permitting that better joined-up decision-making. And many innovative and digital projects are best developed through iterative Agile methods, which can clash with those established systems for project approval, for business planning and budgeting. So in this session, we'll consider how programme approval, management and governance processes can best be adapted to support more innovation across government. I'm now going to introduce our fantastic panel members. We have Paul O'Neill. Paul is Deputy Chief Executive of Operations and General Counsel, Serious Fraud Office in New Zealand. Hello, Paul. And Paul was chair of, morning to you over there in New Zealand. Paul was chair of a workshop yesterday for finance, tax, fraud and debt professionals. So we'll be getting their particular kind of take on this. Then I'd like to introduce Vesa Lipponen, who's Chief Information Officer from the Ministry of Finance in Finland. And Vesa was chair of a workshop yesterday that included programme and project management professionals. So we'll have a slightly different point of view coming back from the feedback from that workshop. And I'm delighted today to be joined in person, because it's a very rare thing at the moment. We are appropriately socially distanced here in the studio by Matthew Rees, who's Director of Regulation and Economics, Single Source Regulations Office in the United Kingdom. Hello, Matthew. And you chaired the workshop yesterday that had commercial and procurement officials. Yeah. Okay. And then last, but definitely not least, we have Kevin Cunnington, who's Director General, International Government Service, United Kingdom. And Kevin also chaired a workshop yesterday, and that included, that was on governance of cross-departmental programmes, but you had kind of civil servants from different professions and different backgrounds, so a whole group of people in that workshop. So that will be a different perspective as well. I'm going to kick off by asking each of our panel members a slightly different question. Then we'll go into a bit of a discussion around a couple of other questions. And then, as I said, if you're watching, please don't forget to submit any questions that you would like answered, because we really do have great expertise in the room here, and it would be a shame to waste that opportunity. Paul, I'm going to come to you first, and I'm going to ask you, do you think there are any innovations in New Zealand that you think have helped to support collaboration and better programme governance?
Yeah, I think there are a couple I'd like to mention. The first one would be, I suppose, a set of conditions which encouraged a different way of thinking, and I think probably quite really genuine innovation. And that was the introduction of a wellbeing approach in New Zealand to both formulating budgets, policy, and I suppose the targets of the government of the day. And that was a shift away from a GDP focus on performance, which was the traditional one, and obviously quite an effective way of measuring the economic output of a country, but relatively one-dimensional. And so the wellbeing approach forced each government department and put them in a position where they had to consider it from a different perspective, had to consider sort of wellbeing domains, which I think promoted, firstly, a different language. So you were looking at outcomes around well-being that included things like civic engagement and governance, cultural identity, environment, health, housing, those type of domains. So it put people in a position where they're formulating what the achievements of the program might be in a different language, and it had to be more creative around the targets they were going to set and how they were going to achieve them. It also, I think, put people in a position where collaboration was essential. You were having to connect the outcomes that you might be trying to achieve. In our context at the Serious Fraud Office, it was fraud prevention and ensuring good checks and balances in place to ensure public money wasn't lost. But you had to connect those with the specific opportunities that might be gained or lost through that activity in spaces like education or health or housing. And it was one of those genuinely disruptive type of changes whereby it made a lot of finance professionals a little bit uncomfortable because it was a different way of thinking and a different way of measuring and framing up the programs they were running. But it actually led to a lot of innovative thinking, I think, because people just had to frame things in a different way. And it meant that collaboration wasn't just important, it was essential because you were in a position where you had to connect your outcomes and the way your program was running with other outcomes. And that collaboration led, from a personal perspective, to better counter-fraud measures, to better thought given about the opportunities that were being missed and the information that could be shared across different areas to get better outcomes. So that was one innovation that we discussed yesterday from a New Zealand perspective that seemed to really work.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's such a brilliant example to start with. And I know it's one that many other countries now are looking to see if they can adopt a similar approach as well. And it is interesting how just choosing that outcome forced so many different parts of the kind of government structure to work in a different way. Thank you. Besa, I'm going to come to you. In terms of your workshop yesterday, how do you think that program and project managers, how are they saying that they want to work more innovatively?
Thank you for asking. We did have some time to discuss about this thing. And the best thing, I think, was that we had this, well, it's not a good thing, but we did have this disruption about the COVID-19. And it sort of changed a lot of things that we have been doing. We have been more agile. We have been faster than normally. The politicians normally ask us to be very risk-orientated, that we wouldn't make mistakes, we wouldn't throw away the taxpayers' money, so to say. And now we have been faster than before, and it makes the working also more agile. We have to do more co-work than normally, and I think this is something that people really are looking forward to doing. For example, we had in Finland this application that you can put your virus infection in place on your own phone. And the phone then tells you how many people you have been in contact with. We have the Bluetooth in the phone, and it took only 3 months to get this done. Normally, it would take a lot longer. There was legislation we had to change, and then there's the technical part of course. There is a security problem or issues that you have to take account, and I would say it would take 1 to 2 years, even if you got the finance. Now we got the finance very fast, and the results were done fast because there was simultaneous really working lawyers and the technicians, engineers, and this is something that we I think really enjoy and are going to probably see more in the future. Although it's hard to say how much we actually adapt from this abnormal situation. Is it the new normal, or is it something that we do now and then afterwards just look back and hope that we could have that back? I hope not. I hope we can adapt a lot of this kind of things.
Thank you. That's another really interesting example, and hopefully we can touch on, I think, COVID and how it's forced innovation has come up in so many of the panels today. Maybe we can touch on that a bit in the discussion afterwards, whether we can all capture those lessons learned, as you say, and not lose some of that learning. But also, I just think it's fascinating what you said. Part of this event, obviously, is about sharing best practice around the globe, not just across departments. And the idea of the COVID apps, there's a brilliant example of where I think countries could have shared kind of best practice probably more effectively than they have as well. Not mentioning the UK, of course. Matthew, I'm going to come over to you now to say, in terms of your workshop yesterday, so what examples of innovation did the officials come up with, and what do they feel about kind of innovation in their area?
Well, I think starting with that second question, certainly unilateral support for the proposition that governance is really strained when we get into innovation. So we ran an audience poll and that was confirmed. And I thought sort of examples came across a whole range of fields really, defence procurement, the regulation of defence procurement that I'm involved in, but also things around government balance sheet management and the management of contingent liabilities. Obviously, that the audience on my workshop was from the finance point of view as well as procurement. So the sort of examples that are coming up there were around issuing loan guarantees. That's quite a prevalent issue now across the COVID response game. So what we see there is some concerns about how departments develop their own policies in isolation and whether there's sufficient coordination from the centre. But on the opposite side, when you get too much central direction, whether that stifles innovation and prevents people from solving the issues specific to their policy area.
When you say procurement, again, I think that's something that in COVID people had to move really fast. Did people say anything about what they've learned in terms of this current period, in terms of how that could be done better?
Well, I think generally speaking, people are keen to follow the regulations, and that requires, I think, ostensibly a level playing field for all participants in a market, but quite often the pace at which you move just makes it very difficult. So, as we see in numerous areas of policy now, getting to the market, getting supply of any description that suits the purpose is probably prioritised now over that theoretical market competition that procurement was set up for. So, I think people are obviously obliged to get value for money in process 8, and that came across from all walks of the participants on this. I think the concern really is that the governance has really fitted the task. I guess the dimension that typically goes vertically is around value. So you delegate down the small stuff and you centralise it, in charge of the large stuff. But whether that's the right dimension to be prioritising all the time.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic, thank you. And Kevin, I'm going to come to you. So you had the workshop with officials from different professions, a whole range of different professions. How did they think that the pandemic had affected cross-departmental working? And picking up on what Reza had said, did they think there were lessons that we could draw from this period in terms of how civil services had responded?
Yeah, I think so. We did focus a little bit on the domestic, but also, as you might expect, given my job title, on internationally as well. And oddly enough, we've been incredibly busy internationally throughout the pandemic. And it shows, I believe, that there is a genuine desire to collaborate internationally. And what we've done is we've curated 3 good examples for you, and then 1 settings where we found it more difficult. So in terms of initiatives we've been asked to help and share, we've had quite a lot of interest from other countries on best practice for video conferencing, how to make them more interactive. So I think what most of us found, particularly at the start, is they tend to be quite broadcasting. So we spent a lot of time and energy as the UK trying to introduce polling, trying to introduce questions, trying to introduce more interaction, mix it up a bit by using different speakers to keep it interesting. And we've been sharing that knowledge with other countries as well. The other thing we've been asked to help out on is training for digital. Previously, all our digital training for civil servants was in the classroom. We've now virtualised all that, and that's proved to be very popular with a number of countries who want to continue to make progress in digital during the lockdown. And then finally, I chaired a UN conference last week on what's called Safe Tech. Safe Tech is a set of technologies that are used to help keep the internet safe from cyberbullying, underage admissions and the like. And there's a lot of interest across the world on what the UK is doing in this space where we're genuine a leader, and a lot of interest in collaborating with us, both to create the similar sets of legislation, but also to harness the same set of tools. And then finally, some of the areas we found more difficult though. So yesterday, the workshop found that people find it much more difficult to build new teams. I've experienced that myself. I think we all find it just a little bit harder to disagree with people virtually, because everything come across quite in the same way. And it's quite difficult to read people's body language virtually as well, which I think doesn't help that situation. Interestingly, though, people think there's much more emphasis now on having good documentation ahead of meetings, and people are taking more time and effort to carefully read the documentation. So in general, we've remained very busy. I think there's a tremendous amount of willingness to continue to collaborate internationally, and things have been going pretty well for us.
Brilliant, thanks. That's a nice positive note to end that first round of comments on. I do want to pick up though on what you said. There are still some barriers. There are still some, especially in terms of big projects, big kind of governance issues and finance issues. So I want to come to each of you, picking up not just on what was said in your workshop yesterday, although I'm interested to hear that, but also from your own experiences. What do you think are the most stubborn obstacles that still exist when it comes to innovation in the area of program governance and finance? We will talk a minute about how we overcome them, but I'm just interested in your thoughts on what are those really stubborn issues, because we've been talking about things like better cross-departmental working, better collaboration for years and years and years, and I think now as the pandemic has shown the need for cross-country kind of collaboration as well. But what are some of the other issues? I'm going to mix it. I'm going to come to Vesa first on this one.
Thank you. Yes, come up with a lot of barriers in the workshop, and it wasn't hard to find those even before the workshop. So I think the most obvious one or the biggest one is the fear of the new. We do want innovation, but we want the innovation to be something cute that we can keep on our hands and say that, look, this is my new innovation. But unfortunately, the innovation doesn't work that way. It usually changes things. And the change is something that we are very scared of in a government level. I don't mean this individually. We do have great people here and I know globally everywhere. But basically, the change isn't the normal thing to do for a government. So this is the first thing. And then there is the not knowing what's going to come, like the unknown outcomes of the innovation that are the problem. And then there is, when you put those sort of not knowing exactly what you're doing, you're creating a big change, but not actually knowing, is it going to work or not? And then there comes the idea of, this might be a risk to my career, to this company, this organization, or it's a political risk. And this is the most hard thing. Everybody wants those quick wins or wins. Nobody wants those losses. Yeah. And this is the thing that I think is the most sort of biggest problem with this one. And I think we should sort of understand the risk that we are taking, then put it down and accept it, and try to move on. That would be sort of our group and my way of trying to come over that fear.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. That really picks up on themes that have emerged from other panels about some of the biggest obstacles are not necessarily the structures or the lack of infrastructure. They're about kind of human things, about culture and fear, and those kind of issues coming out as well. Matthew, I'm going to come to you. Do you agree with that? Are the biggest obstacles cultural or are they structural?
Well, I think certainly cultural. I mean, I think we all know that teams work best when they bring a range of skills and diversity. And that certainly came across in our workshops. But the theme I wanted to pick up was the difference between the project and the portfolio. And I think we saw a number of examples, both in the public and private sector, where if government looks at things as a portfolio, then it can take more risk because it's got more opportunity. And certainly the examples, and I've certainly had experience personally in the private sector, where you know that certain sort of innovations will fail, but you know that, and that's not a failure. Whereas in the public sector, you can't tolerate a single failure, and that's often because things are a little bit siloed, either at the project level, they're not looking at the program portfolio, or at a government level, they're not looking at it across the departments, they're looking at each department individually. And it's unfair to criticise individual departments or teams because they're doing the best with what they know. But I think what's missing sometimes is the ability to talk across departments, across disciplines, across organisations, and across the public-private boundaries. That's really where you see success coming from portfolios, and we can see the big technology ventures that have thrived on that. Investors thrive on that. We're all familiar with it in all walks of life, but when it comes to the classic vertical departmental lines, it's somehow left out of the picture. So I think that's perhaps a key theme that's come across. I think we can see that applied in other circumstances where the portfolio is better than it's worth more than the individual parts, and it tolerates some failures, and wants to find those successes within that.
Brilliant, thank you. That was again another theme that's come up in lots of the workshops and panels today. Kevin, I'm going to ask you, it's going to get harder as I come to the last two panel members to say what are the biggest obstacles. So if they've already been said, feel free to just say that. But what do you think are the really big, stubborn obstacles that are still there?
So, well, we, let's say in English, ate our own dog food, Siobhan, and we did a bit of polling around our workshop. And interestingly enough, genuinely thought this would be the opposite. 67% of people said that innovation and collaboration had improved during the pandemic. But one of the examples, before we did the breakouts, I took the opportunity to give people one or two examples to think about from my own experience. And the following one that I'm going to describe now landed particularly well with people. So I talked about when I first joined the civil service, and we wanted to move away from, if you like, our existing procedures and controls to working in an agile way. And government's agile methodology comprises a number of stages, but the first two stages are, first of all, we do a discovery, and that is to figure out whether we can really state the problem in the right way and we know the problem we're trying to fix. The second part we call alpha, which is building a set of prototypes. So we establish in our own mind that we actually understand the problem and we have the technology to address it. When we did a survey of all the original Agile projects in the Department of Work and Pensions, we found out that it cost as much in time and money to go through the process than it did to do the work, if that doesn't make sense. So it's equally as expensive just to follow the process as it was, or to get through the bureaucracy as it was to get to the end point and have an output. And so the Permanent Secretary and I agreed a new approach, because clearly this was madness. Would have a large fund available to me, and I could authorize anyone, within some provisions of good sense, to start Discovery and Alpha, and I would pay for that. And then if that was all successful, and it need not be successful, because we accepted that in some of these things it's better to fail, and if you're going to fail, it's better to fail fast, as we described it, then we could go on to proceed. But actually just giving me the latitude to allow people to crack on from day one, not worry about the bureaucracy, but just try and get to an outcome that was either positive or would failed, and we accepted we need to go back and rethink the idea, or it wasn't a good idea at all, was tremendously innovative. And we had lots more people coming forward then, because they could see that they could get on with things rather more quickly than they'd used to. They could avoid the bureaucracy, and that was a really positive outcome for us back in that's about 6 years ago now, the early days.
I like the way you've given that, you kind of turn that round to show the way things should be done. But I guess by giving us that example, you're saying one of the obstacles is that other people aren't given that space to kind of test things out in that way and be able to fail in that kind of way as well. Paul, I'm going to come to you for your thoughts on kind of what are some of those big constraints and obstacles that are still in the way for innovating when it comes to large projects and big programs and finance.
Yeah, sure. And to echo some of the other panelists' comments, I think it's really a mindset shift which is required and which is the barrier at the moment. From my perspective, and some of the examples I've experienced during COVID in particular is, firstly, a failure to engage outside of your space, and in particular with the private sector. When we look at sort of COVID relief programs, private sector organisations are often going to be part of the delivery chain, or they're going to understand processes and backgrounds that are really relevant to what you're trying to design. but there's been a reluctance to sort of access the private sector's information and channels of communication, and that really needs to change. And leading on from that, I think one of the things we tested with sort of the myths and realities, and this is in a New Zealand context, but it probably exists in other jurisdictions, around the ability to share information. You obviously have to do it appropriately. You have to do it in line with the relevant restrictions around privacy and data sharing in your jurisdiction. But there's a real reticence to, I suppose, examine the full extent of those information sharing abilities. There's a perception that we just can't share, or if we share in that way, that will be inappropriate. And you know, you get that from a certain extent. It's a risk-averse approach to take, and in some context, sensible. But COVID put us in a position where we had to test our ability to share information. It was found that I think a lot of public sector agencies and a lot of people trying to design programs were actually far short of the limits of their ability to share information, and COVID put those people in a position where they had to test that and either be a bit innovative with how they framed it and how they treated the information before they shared it, or just to reassess what those abilities actually were. And I suppose the last point I'd mentioned was I think we underuse, so government's ability to acquire information has far outpaced its ability to deal with it sensibly. We get a lot of information in, but we're not as good yet at analysing it as we are at collecting it. And COVID, I think, put us in a position where the sort of centres of expertise across government, which have the ability to analyse information using data analytics or artificial intelligence in some instances, that information being shared and an ability to deal with the wealth of data that we actually have is essential, because otherwise we're just sitting on a lot of information which will give us comfort and make us feel well informed, but if we're not dealing with it appropriately and actually analysing it and getting full value for it. In some ways the collection's a waste of resource, but the ability to deal with it is out there if you connect with other agencies, either in the government sector or in the private sector, with some innovative ways to actually deal with the information you've got.
Examples there, concrete examples, and totally agree with the that we could be much better at sharing information. We've done some sessions today on data sharing, for example, and people not understanding what they can and can't share, but also the need to have the right data and share it in the right way. So I think management of it really important. We've had a question come in from Brad Bass. So I'm going to ask this to all of you, and it does touch on what we've been saying about kind of cross-agency, cross-departmental working, and I certainly found this myself when I was in the civil service. So Brad says, I've found that the most difficult aspect of cross-agency collaboration is transferring funds between government agencies so that the programme spending can flow through one government agency, typically the lead agency. Is this an issue that emerged in your sessions, and how are other countries coping with this issue? So I'm going to ask for your thoughts on that, either from your workshop or from your own thoughts on that issue as well. Is funding one of the key obstacles to kind of cross-agency, cross-departmental working? And Matthew, why don't we start with your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, no, this has come up actually. I'm not sure it came up so clearly in the workshop, but I certainly had that experience when looking at contingent liabilities. So the Treasury ran what's known as a balance sheet review and was trying to figure a way to put a central capability into government to help manage all the loan guarantee schemes. It was pretty timely actually, because all of that work was published just before COVID, and since then there's been a huge expansion of guarantees. But that issue of how does a central expertise charge for its services across government, or should it just be free at the point of use, is a real challenge. I think it's not necessarily a level playing field if you're going to have no charging model. Do people take that advice for granted? Do they overburden it? Can the department that's given that responsibility cover its costs? Does it add value? Is it ultimately a market participant? So I think that is a central question that's probably worth exploring in quite a few aspects of it. Internal charging models, I don't think they're particularly commonplace in government. There's one example which I think works really well, which is the Government Actuaries Department. I mean, they're specifically covering their costs with a small surplus over their running costs. And I don't think anybody challenges that as a market distortion, frankly, but that's clearly a risk. If you've got a field of other suitably qualified actuaries who might otherwise supply government, how do you avoid the captive supplier giving itself an advantage. But I mean, I think this is the problem: is the economics comes out all the time and starts to crowd out just the ability to get solutions in place.
Thanks, Matthew. Kevin, have you got thoughts on this, on the kind of funding being the issue?
Coming off my microphone. I have. Oh, I'm still. No, I'm okay on time.
No, it's good. You're good. You're back in the room.
Sorry. I do agree with. I think it's Brad, wasn't it, that put the question up?
Yeah.
Funding is an issue. We talked through a couple of very good examples yesterday of where it worked, and if I explain where it worked, then perhaps choose that to focus on a limitation that we found. So we had a couple of really good examples in the UK. We had a service called Check Your State Pension, which is a collaboration between HMRC and the Department of Work and Pensions. And to your point, that budget was held by DWP, and they actually paid for HMRC to do the work. We had another really good example, which was between the Department of Work and Pensions and the Health Service, that addresses payments for people with terminal illness, which is obviously a key concern. And the old paper system was really very inefficient, and they managed to automate this service in a way that Macmillan nurses, who are generally the most prevalent people using the service, could type in information on behalf of a patient, and the patient got paid almost immediately. So big improvement. But in both those examples, the pension example, the teams were co-located in Newcastle, and in the health example, both the teams were co-located in Leeds. And we came to the conclusion that kind of co-location is somewhat essential for cross-departmental collaboration. It wasn't the funding. You could get around the funding, but we never seemed to get around the need to co-locate people. So our bigger obstacle was not funding, but co-location.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to come for your thoughts on this, because with your well-being approach and how much that forced departments to work together, you must have had these issues around funding streams as well come up, and shifts of funding. So how was that dealt with?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things that assists is we've also had some public sector reforms which require government departments, what it's intended to do is force them not to act in silos and have chief executives and people in senior positions with each government agency work in accordance with broad principles rather than just their agency's mandate. So that, aligned with wellbeing, puts them in a position where the funding issues, they haven't presented themselves as a major issue because you're just expected to deal with them. The position is that you're pursuing broad principled outcomes that sit across different agencies. So you're expected to be less protective and less territorial about your own budgets and your own funding streams. That's just the expectation. And from my perspective, I'd agree that sort of getting people to share information, to co-locate and work together, breaking that mindset's actually been more of a difficulty than the funding issue, because that's just been sort of taken off the table, and people have been directed, that's not the argument we need to have. We need to have the argument, or have the discussion around how we're best sharing resources and pursuing common aims, rather than getting caught up in funding issues. And so far, fingers crossed, that issue hasn't really been on the table for us.
Be fascinating. I mean, that what you say, that issue around getting people to be less protective of their funding kind of pot. It would be so fascinating to do lessons learned from how that happens in New Zealand, because that's such a fundamental issue, I think, to driving this type of change. Vesa, do you think in Finland this idea of funding and funding streams between agencies who are expected to collaborate, is that a big issue as well? Is that a difficulty?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, this is very, very familiar, and I think it comes to mind when there are something like innovative processes where you have to create something new. Then you usually have different departments, different ministries, private partnership combined. Then it becomes hard. Sometimes it can be bypassed by giving a lot of money to some sort of program, for example, for IE, and then you pick up the things you want to do, or the proof of concepts, or the pilots you want to do. But in larger scale, it's always a problem when you have different parties where you have the finance spread over. I think both Kevin and Paul said it well. There is territorial thinking. We already got our money. We can do what we want with it. And the problem is that sometimes we don't have the shared vision what we are going to do. And I think we should spend more time about thinking about the vision and what we are doing, and then narrowing down what can be done, and just try to do it. And this is also a problem, not just cross-departmental within the government, but when you have the private sector in it. Too often we sort of just make a procurement protocol and ask the private sector to do something for us, but we don't tell what we are trying to achieve in a big picture. And this should be something that we should do. And yes, I think I have at least 2 or 3 projects at the moment that are struggling with this problem of trying to get the finance to everybody that needs it and try to get everything working. And it seems that it's even harder now that everybody works remote, that we are on a video conference or just trying to communicate via email. We should be able to sit in the same room and just think about it. We are not coming out until we can solve this sort of thing. But those are my thoughts, sorry.
Okay, thanks, Faisal. So Brad, the answer to your question is yes, this is a problem for other countries as well. But there are some examples there, including the ones Kevin gave, of where it can work. We just need to get that right. And obviously in New Zealand as well, where the culture change has actually then led to a change in the way funding is approached. I want to end then. This is probably the last round. The time has flown past, but this is probably, we've got time for one round of thoughts and comments, and I want to end on a positive note. And again, this can pick up on your workshop yesterday and what the official said there, but also on your personal kind of experience. We've talked about the obstacles, so we've talked about cultural obstacles, we've talked about structural obstacles and barriers, and then we talked about the funding issues as well. But I want to talk about maybe what are some of the enablers, what are some of the good examples that maybe you've seen. We've already had some great ones from Kevin and from Paul there as well. But also, if there was sort of one thing that you could change that you think would help facilitate innovation, what would that be? So I'm leaving it quite open, just something positive from your point of view to end on. And I'm going to go back to the original order. So Paul, I'm going to ask you to kick off this one.
Sure. Well, probably touch on the example I just gave in the terms of our reform of public sector legislation. What that did was sort of break down, or was intended to break down, the silos that existed by putting in place broad principles that chief executives and heads of ministries were responsible for, intending to sort of not just make collaboration I suppose a goal, but it was legislatively mandated that collaboration and that principled thinking was expected. That said, it's easy to write a piece of legislation and to reflect culture that exists right at the top. If there was one thing that I would take out of it in terms of lessons learned, it's easy for people at a chief executive level to sort of talk the talk in terms of complying with the legislation. But what is really needed at that sort of more middle level is creating an environment where risk-taking within an appropriate context and innovation is actually encouraged. Yeah. Because that's where the environment's created. The tone from the top, which everyone always talks about, is really important, but it's that level down, actually creating an environment which means that people aren't just looking for risk-free innovation, innovation as long as nothing goes wrong. So people actually at that level need to reflect both the legislation and what their heads of agencies are saying, and create an environment where the people at an operational level feel actually able to innovate, to take risks, and to try things, because otherwise, the legislation will look good, it'll read well, and it'll come across well in speeches and departmental pronouncements, but it won't actually translate to work on the ground until that mid-level takes on board the message as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I like that. We've had lots of talk today about leadership from the top. I think you're absolutely right. If it doesn't then go down to that next level down, then it kind of stalls almost before it can have the right impact. Thank you so much. Vesa, over to you for something very positive to end on.
Thank you. It's always nice to end things positive, but I think for us in Finland, and I think the workshop, we could also say the same thing, that the crisis is the best thing that happens. Then you have to lower your hierarchy and you have to make quick decisions. And this is something that we should try on, probably not have the crisis all the time, but sort of simulate it. And that said, it's sort of safe environment to do things. You don't have to get permission for every little decision you make. This is important. I would say it would be the best idea to try to get together as much different people as you can. People should be different from each other. The skills should be different, and then give them impossible missions, because people are motivated in different ways, and there are some people that actually run towards when somebody says fire. And when you have those people that are willing to put themselves in it and to risk it all, then you can get results. But you have to give them in a safe environment. You don't fire them every time they fail. So this, I think, would be my lesson for this one.
Thank you so much. I think that whole issue of diversity of workforce and how diversity and innovation work together is really interesting. Could be a whole conference in itself. I don't think we probably spent enough time on that throughout the panels today, so that's really good. Matthew, I'm going to come to you.
Yes, thank you. I think so. Teamwork probably sums it up. I mean, I think the example we had was that finance and the governance is sometimes seen as the enemy of the gatekeeper or the judge on people who are just trying to get something solved. So you know, the procurement team, the commercial team need the help. They need their colleagues to work with them to get the right solution. And clearly that needs to be capable of being inspected, and scrutiny is important, but it's the teamwork that brings it all together, actually, rather than an adversarial relationship, which, you know, frankly doesn't work very well.
And do you think there are any great examples that you know of kind of in the UK at the moment, or anything that you've seen during the pandemic?
Well, I've been lucky to have a portfolio of a career, public and private sector, and where I've seen this work really well is where, sitting on a board in a non-exec capacity, we can give discretion to a strategic investment fund, to be a good example, where the leadership, the people on the ground to do the work, know that they've got the challenge and the support to take the risks and yield benefit, and that's a very commercial approach. I think certainly in the workshop yesterday, people who'd seen their support and their kind of business-minded colleagues work with them to achieve things better. That's a kind of good model. So I think it's about having a supportive and challenging governance arrangement from the top, but the teamwork, to get on and solve problems together. That certainly came out in our workshop as well as my experience.
So that real sense of a collaborative team where people feel safe enough to try maybe new things and not feel safe to fail. Thank you. Kevin, I'm going to come to you, which will probably be the last comments on this as well. So you've already given some great examples, but I'm going to ask you for even more. What do you think, kind of the biggest things that could be done, enablers to kind of help facilitate innovation in this space?
Yeah, so I guess I'll give you 7 tips, not just one, if that's okay, Siobhan.
Wow, yeah, definitely.
Why there's 7. So I guess for people not based here in the UK and not familiar with a benefit system called Universal Credit, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was asked to help redesign Universal Credit using digital and Agile. And just to give you some perspective on Universal Credit, it's the biggest welfare reform of a century. We've never done anything like this in government before. We combined 6 benefits. Those benefits pay out about £60 billion annually. There are at any point about 1 million people claiming unemployment in the UK, slightly more at the moment, and we employ about 55,000 staff. So we had to design a system to do that digitally and in an agile way. And truth is, we've done it, and it's been very successful during the pandemic. But what we found was the most common mistake people make when they try and do these sorts of things is they set off too early without getting all their ducks in a row or their eggs aligned. etc. So we wrote a book called The 7 Lenses of Transformation. I think Andrew's going to post a link. And it's a kind of beginner's guide to what you need to think about on any of these major transformations. And it comprises 7 lenses, 7 perspectives. One is you need to get the vision right. If you can't explain what you're trying to do, there's no point know how to follow. 2, you need to get the design right. 3, you need to have a plan. 4, we've touched on all these things, but you need to have transformational leadership, people that really understand how to do these things. Number 5, we explicitly called out collaboration as a key element and psychology within the program. And then finally, you need accountability. You need to know who's accountable for what. And finally, of course, with all great challenges, you need the right people. And if people haven't read the UK's book on how to do transformation, I would suggest you follow the link, have a look. It's gold, really. It helps you avoid all the common mistakes that we talk about time and time again. And actually nowadays in UK government, we don't make quite so frequently as we used to.
Thank you. So I think the link will be available there. I think if people want to follow that, and already of the 7 tips you mentioned, there's so many of those came up in our panel discussion now, in panel discussions earlier today. So setting a clear vision, leadership, collaboration, all of those things. I want to say a huge thank you to our panel members. Thank you so much, real expertise in the room. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you to everybody who was watching that panel as well. We're going to take a short break now, but I will be back very soon after that with, I think, what is the final panel of the day. So goodbye for now, but I will see you again very soon. And a big thanks to all our panel members. Thank you so much.